Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to continue the new to me series where I read a selection of books in a genre or by an author that I don't have any experience with. This time I'm tackling Stephen King. Now this video is going to be actually divided into two parts. Today, in the first part, I'm going to talk about the actual books that I read and my feelings about each book in particular. And then in part two, which should come out in a couple of days, I'm going to talk about my overall feelings about King. And basically, if I'm going to read any more Stephen King books in the future. Will he be an auto-buy author? Will he, will I only read certain types of books? Anyways, so let's just get started today with the books that I read and how I felt about them. This whole project, this has been an intention of mine for a very long time, is including Stephen King in the new to me video series, because, and I'll get more into this in part two, but basically, Stephen King is sort of like the author of my generation, or it could be argued that he is the author of my generation, and it's sort of been a thing for me that I hadn't read any of his books yet, so it was always my intention to do this. However, the timing is what it is because a coworker of mine, shout out to Jackie if you're watching, strongly recommended that I read Cujo by Stephen King. And so I just figured, hey, if I'm going to read Cujo, I'm just going to binge some Stephen King in order to do this video. So that's how it happened, and that is what I read first, was Cujo. And I've talked about Cujo a couple of times in some recent videos on this channel without ever being real specific about it, so get ready. We're about to get real specific about it. Cujo is the story of two families living in Castle Rock, Maine. Tad is a young boy. He's the son of Vic and Donna. And then Brett is the son of Joe and Charity. And Brett owns a dog named Cujo. So the book tells a lot of stories about each of the people in these families and even some other townspeople. And eventually, Cujo becomes infected with rabies and terrorizes Tad and his mom, Donna. If you've been paying attention, then you know that I'm not the biggest fan of Cujo, mostly because I walked into it expecting a completely different experience than the one that I received. The book is less about this tense and thrilling circumstance of a rabid dog as a villain and a mother and son as victims. And it's more about all of these different stories that King tells, all of the detail that he goes into about every member of these two families and even some of their friends. It is it's like detail and information overload in Cujo. So much so that it became obvious to me very early on that the book was not really about this main event. That's kind of like plot. That's what everything is written around, but the book itself is so much more than this altercation between dog and mother and son. There's even portions of this book written from Cujo's perspective. So I can say that it's a really interesting novel, but that ultimately I was disappointed because I did expect through King, through this legacy that I've always heard of King having, this really terrifying, chilling experience. And mostly it was just about reading backstory. Ultimately, it comes down to this, and I think that I've said this. Ultimately, Cujo was interesting. Cujo, if I knew what Cujo was going into it, I would never have picked it up, regardless of the author. And I think that what other people considering reading the book need to know is that this is not nonstop excitement or tension or suspense. This is mostly an in-depth look at how people making selfish decisions individually end up contributing as a whole to these horrific events. There aren't a lot of redeemable characters in the book. In fact, only the children came across as very redeemable, and that started my mind going as well. Like, I haven't read every Stephen King book. I've only read 5, but I would say that in general, I get the impression that Stephen King sort of places children and their innocence up on pedestals and chips away sometimes at his younger characters by the actions and decisions of selfish adults within the story. So that's my theory. If I had the rest of my life to study King novels, I would probably develop that into a really cool sort of project, or thesis, or whatever, but I don't. So ultimately I ended up giving Cujo like 3 or 3.5 stars, I believe, because I can't deny that it was interesting. I just wish that I had known what it was before I jumped into reading it. After Cujo, I had some decisions to make as far as what books I wanted to read for this project. I knew one thing. I wanted to read Misery, because Misery is always a story that interests me. I remember very clearly Stephen King getting in his own car accident and how the media always linked it back to his book Misery, and was that book foreshadowing, etc., etc. So it has this, I mean, I've just heard of it. The movie is super popular. Like, I just wanted to read it. I never saw the film, but something about Misery always interested me. If you don't know, Misery is the story of an author named Paul who is driving in Colorado during a snowstorm, gets into an accident. He's rescued by a woman named Annie, and Annie is his self-proclaimed #1 fan. And the problem is that Annie is not the most mentally healthy person. And Paul has recently ended a series, Annie's favorite series, by killing off the main character. And that upsets Annie very, very much. So though she rescues Paul from his car accident, she actually holds him captive and forces him to write the book that she wants him to write, to bring back her favorite character. Super awesome concept. And I have to say that I really enjoyed Misery. I ended up giving Misery 4 stars. I think it was more like the Stephen King I thought I was going to be reading. It was chilling and kind of, suspenseful and gruesome at times. And it just felt more like I was in the zone. I was in the King zone at that point. Now, I do have to say that one of my favorite parts of this book is Annie. Annie is probably I'm gonna make a really big statement here, but Annie is probably the best written character I've ever read about. Me personally, I can't proclaim that she's the best character in all of literature, but King does an amazing job in Misery of making Annie batshit crazy, but not, she's not a caricature of a crazy person. She's not, she's nuts and she's ridiculous and outlandish, but at the same time, she's so realistic. It's so realistic, especially when King talks about Annie's more depressive stage and what that character does, how that character behaves. it's just so perfectly executed. The character of Annie, I don't like her. I mean, she's the villain. So I don't like her, but I love her. I love the way she's written. I love the way she comes to life. She will be probably the most memorable part of this entire experiment, this entire project for me. The character of Annie in the book Misery. It's amazing. Amazing. Next, I wanted to read another book that had always been intriguing to me because of the 1980s adaptation. That book is Firestarter. And this was officially the absolute worst book that I read for this project. I'm hesitant to say that any of Stephen King's books are bad books. I mean, you don't become Stephen King by writing bad books. And I think that there's things that King puts in his novels and efforts that King makes with every single novel that ensures that they are quality books, that they're written well, etc. But for me, the story's not there. So Firestarter is the story of Charlie and her dad, Andy. Now, Andy and Charlie are on the run. That's where the book begins. They're being hunted down, for lack of a better term, by a fictional government agency known as the Shop. And the reason that the Shop is interested in getting their hands on Andy and Charlie is because through an experiment in Andy's past, he married a woman who had participated in the same experiment, and together they had Charlie, and Charlie was gifted with the ability of pyrokinesis. She can set fires with her mind and her emotions, etc. So the Shop wants to get a hold of Charlie, use her as a weapon. And the story follows, the whole beginning of the story follows Andy and Charlie as they perpetually escape capture, and then takes a big switch to Andy and Charlie in an institution having been captured, and then has this crazy ending, yet let downish of an ending. No spoilers. God, this book, I couldn't stand this book. Again, I walked into it expecting to feel a lot for Andy and Charlie, to be under a lot of pressure from suspense, wanting them to get away all the time. Like, it just wasn't there. Instead, King makes the decision to not focus entirely on Andy and Charlie, but to also extend the story to include details and perspectives of members of this organization, the Shop. What I wanted to be a very, very tense, suspenseful, passionate, fire breathing kind of novel, the inclusion of the law enforcement really applied this antiseptic to the book. The book became very sterile and very not fun. It just wasn't fun. Not to mention the huge shifts, the being on the run, not being on the run, and then what happens after that. It just felt disjointed. It felt, I there's some impressive scenes in the novel where Charlie is using her abilities. I think that King can imagine some pretty impressive things. But in general, I think Firestarter is the best example of one of my main problems with King, I think. But we just spend too much time in the heads of characters we don't want to spend time in their heads, Not to that extent. I think he went too far in making us spend time with the villain. I think that it's good to get a clear understanding of a villain's motivations, etc. But like, I don't want to know as much about my villain as I do my protagonist, because that all that time can be spent enriching my empathy for the protagonist. Do you know what I'm saying? And instead, my attention and my emotions are being diverted, and I'm having to sit through this really painful, informative type sections of book about the bad guy. I just, not a fan. So again, like 2.5 stars, I can't say, oh, Stephen King, this is a bad novel. Like, that's, no. But worse than Cujo, as far as its likability from my perspective. So I started to think that maybe my preconceived notions were really hurting me in this project. So I wanted to read a book I'd never heard of, if that was possible. Turns out it is. I mean, there's a few Stephen King novels that I've never heard of, but the one that I was most intrigued by was Gerald's Game, written in 1992, which was another objective of mine, was to find books that did span King's career, just to get the best selection, the most variety of a selection that I could. So anyways, I decided to read Gerald's Game by King. Gerald's Game is maybe one of the most polarizing books in his collection. It is the story of Jessie, who travels to her lake house with her husband Gerald, and it is off season. So the surrounding homes, the lake, it's all pretty much deserted. But Jessie and Gerald have decided to take some time away. They go to the lake house, and Gerald has a proclivity for maybe some BDSM and maybe some more kinky games in the bedroom. And so he handcuffs Jessie to the bed. And then after an argument, Gerald dies, and Jessie is handcuffed to their bed. The psychological impact of that is not hard for me to imagine. It's a novel of Jessie versus herself. And I think, I liked it. I liked it quite a bit. It wasn't perfect. The ending for me was rather weak. But as far as a story and storytelling, it's really impressive. And it showcases a different side of King. Again, just from the other books I had read, I don't have a ton of King experience, obviously. But it showcased to me a micro level writing. Even Cujo, a book I didn't expect to have many characters in it, had a ton of characters in it. More than I ever expected. Misery was still a story about one person versus another. And then I read Gerald's Game, a book about one woman who has to be resourceful, has to hold on to her sanity, and has to get herself out of a predicament. And she only lives if she is strong enough or has enough perseverance or what have you to get out of her situation. It was delicious. I mean, it wasn't even necessarily like a super enjoyable book or a super likable book, but it was a book that really engaged my brain. I wanted to know what was going to happen. I kept thinking to myself, oh God, like, even being isolated, like, isolation has its own set of psychological consequences. But she's also immobilized. She's undressed. She has no food and water. She's trapped with the remains of her husband. So there's an emotional impact. Like, the things that are triggered, the things that her mind brings up to the surface under those circumstances. It was just really interesting. Dang it. I can understand why it's either liked or hated. I happen to fall down on the side of liked, but I get it. I get why other people wouldn't appreciate this, especially after reading other novels by King and then coming across this one. It also has some difficult content or, trigger warnings for sexual abuse, both before and after the age of consent. I imagine that the content is tough for people to take as well, even though Stephen King isn't a stranger to controversial content. So I don't know. It was fun to take that ride. It was cringy at times. And yeah, the only problem that I have with the book is the ending. I think that the ending is a little too easy and it feels a little tacked on. It felt unnecessary. Without spoiling anything, there are some questions about whether or not the things that Jesse is experiencing are real or symptoms of psychosis, or psychosis brought on by the trauma, or dreams. The book would have been perfect if King had just let it be what it was, but I think there may have been some pressure to ground the book in something a little more King-esque, something that was a little bit more characteristic of him as a writer. And so I think the ending was sort of like an addition. The ending was sort of like tacked on, and I think that was a mistake. But anyways, it was really interesting. And finally, I read the book Elevation, and it's only 160 pages. It came out in 2018. I read it both because it was a newer release, it was a short book that I could tack onto the project, and it was different than the books that I had read. For the most part, all of the books that I read could be described as some version of horror. Elevation is not a horror novel. Elevation is one of King's fiction novels with like paranormal elements. The story is about a man named Scott Carey who lives in Castle Rock, Maine, and he is losing weight. He gets on the scale to find that he has lost several pounds, or the number on the scale is a lot lower. However, there's no physical change to Scott's appearance, and it doesn't matter how many clothes he puts on or takes off or what he holds. He weighs the same. So the story is about this mysterious affliction, and also what experiencing it does for Scott's attitude, his outlook, and his priorities. It's a good feeling story. Like, it's really short, and I can't say that it's groundbreaking. I can't say that it accomplishes a ton of stuff, because none of that is true, but you feel good while you're reading it. And it was really refreshing for me to feel good while reading a Stephen King novel. And so for that reason, I liked it. Needless to say, like, the lighter and lighter Scott gets, there's a light, you feel sort of light reading this book. You feel good. You feel this positive, warming outlook on the world. And it's really interesting that that's what happens in this very short 160 page little story. Manages to tell something very unique and manages to kind of make a social statement at the same time. And so, yeah, I liked it. I liked Elevation a lot. Very uncharacteristic or very different. Like, which one of these things don't belong? Elevation is very unlike the other 4 books that I read. But I kind of find that side of King to be refreshing. I like that it's not all horror. It's not all doom and gloom. That he does have a real humanitarian side, a real sensible and sensitive side. I mean, it helped. It was kind of a good way to really end the project. So those are the 5 books I read, which will make it easier to understand part 2 of this video, where I explain my overall feelings about Stephen King and what conclusions I've come to. So I'll see you guys in part 2. Thank you so much for watching.